The hum of whispered voices filled the grand auditorium, each species seated in perfect, anticipatory silence. The alien students, tall, slender, and with luminous eyes, watched with a mix of curiosity and amusement as Raltok, the revered teacher of galactic studies, stepped to the front. His towering form seemed to command the room. His reputation had spread across the galaxy, a master of his craft, brilliant, and unwavering in his belief that no species could match his own kind's intellect, except, perhaps, for a few select others. Raltok's gaze swept the room, landing on the one human among them. Sarah. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat, the weight of every alien stare pressing down on her. She was the only human in the class, chosen for the academy despite being considered inferior by many of the other species. Sarah had always been underestimated. Back on Earth, people saw her as quiet, perhaps even timid. But here, on this alien world, she had been given a chance to prove that humanity had more to offer than what the galaxy believed. But could she? Sarah, Raltok called, his voice booming and filled with authority. Step forward to the board. The silence deepened, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Every eye was on her as she rose slowly, her legs feeling as though they might give out. Her breath came in short gasps. She had never been good with public speaking or the spotlight. Back home, she was just a student in a small classroom, never expected to make any impact. Here, in this grand academy of galactic elites, she felt small. Insignificant. Raltok gestured to the blackboard, where an intricate problem was already written in alien script, symbols that Sarah had never seen before. A language only the most advanced species could understand. The other students watched, their alien features filled with quiet amusement. They knew what was coming. This was no ordinary exam, this was Raltok's way of humbling humans, proving once again that they were not fit for such an esteemed institution. His gaze remained fixed on her, a faint smile playing on his lips, one of condescension. Sarah swallowed hard. The words on the board swirled in her mind, but they felt like an impenetrable puzzle. She could feel Raltok's eyes on her, waiting for her to falter, to give up, to embarrass herself in front of the entire class. But then something strange happened. Her mind, in that instant, seemed to clear. The symbols, though foreign, began to make sense. She wasn't sure why or how, but the patterns began to fall into place. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward. "I'll try," she murmured, almost to herself. As the crowd watched, Sarah's hand reached for the board. It wasn't with the certainty of someone who had memorized the symbols, but with the calm of someone who was learning as she went. The alien script came alive beneath her chalk, twisting and connecting in ways that were far beyond ordinary reasoning. Sarah's strokes were fluid, not perfect, but precise in a way that few could have expected. A few students exchanged glances, uncertain. Raltok's smile faltered for just a moment, his alien eyes narrowing. This was not the humiliation he had envisioned. The room fell silent, the tension building with every second that Sarah worked, her hand moving swiftly across the blackboard. As she finished, she stepped back, holding her breath. Raltok stared at the work before him. His sharp eyes scanned the intricate problem she had just solved, one that had stumped even the brightest students of other species. And yet, Sarah had done it. Her solution was not only correct, but it was done in a way that none of the aliens had thought to approach. For a long moment, Raltok didn't speak. The students, too, were silent, processing what they had just seen. Then, finally, Raltok's voice broke the stillness. His tone was no longer smug or dismissive. It was cautious. "Explain how you arrived at that answer." Sarah felt her throat tighten, her knees weak. How could she explain it? She wasn't entirely sure herself. I saw the patterns. I thought about how similar this is to some of the problems back home, things I've studied there. And then it just clicked. The way the symbols relate to each other felt almost familiar. Raltok blinked. No one had ever explained the alien script like that. No one had ever solved such a problem with such an unconventional method. The silence in the room deepened. The students, once skeptical, were now whispering among themselves. For the first time, Raltok felt something he had never experienced in his long career: doubt. Sarah looked up at him, heart racing. For the first time, she felt like she might just have a place here, even if she was the only human in the room. But Raltok wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. He would have to see more. He would push her further, test her limits. But Sarah was ready. She had already proven something to herself. Humanity, she realized, had more to offer than anyone had ever thought. The classroom was unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the soft scrape of Sarah's chalk against the board as she stood there, hands still trembling. Her heart raced in her chest, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. For a second, she felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for Raltok to either accept or dismiss her answer. Raltok's sharp, alien eyes scanned the blackboard where Sarah's solution now lay in perfect, coherent form. The symbols, which had been so foreign to her, had somehow found their place in her mind, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered just enough for her to recognize their true shape. But she wasn't the only one who had been shocked. The other students, who had initially watched with a mix of amusement and indifference, were now leaning forward in their seats. Whispers ran through the room. Sarah couldn't quite make out the words, but she felt their eyes on her. Some were wide with disbelief, others narrowed with suspicion. None of them expected this. Raltok stood motionless, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the board. He wasn't smiling now. His expression was unreadable, his usual confidence shaken. "Explain," he said, his voice cool but tense. "How did you come to that conclusion?" The class waited with bated breath. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. She wasn't sure how to explain it, how to articulate the way the symbols had clicked into place. It wasn't logic, at least not the cold, mechanical kind of logic Raltok was used to. No, it was something deeper, more intuitive. It was as though the symbols were speaking to her, telling her a story she had to understand. I thought of it like a riddle," Sarah began, her voice shaky. "I looked at the relationships between the symbols, and they reminded me of puzzles I used to solve back home. Not exactly the same, but it felt like there was a pattern hidden within the chaos." Raltok tilted his head, intrigued yet skeptical. "A riddle?" His tone was almost mocking now, as if he didn't fully believe she could have grasped such a complex concept so easily. Sarah's cheeks burned, and she felt the sweat on her palms. But she pressed on. "Yes. I just focused on the idea of symmetry. There are rules in this language, but they're not always obvious. It's not just about logic. Sometimes, it's about recognizing the unseen connections, things that aren't always in plain sight." Raltok took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. "I see," he said slowly, his voice darkening with the weight of something unspoken. "And where exactly did you find these hidden connections?" Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't quite explain it fully, not without sounding like she was making things up, but she knew it was the truth. "I just felt it," she said quietly, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I didn't approach it the same way everyone else would. I didn't try to force the symbols into a box. I let them speak to me." The other students, who had been quiet up until now, began to murmur amongst themselves. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, some filled with disbelief, others a growing respect. Even Raltok seemed to hesitate for a moment, his intense gaze softening, if only slightly. For a long moment, no one said anything. The room was thick with tension, with everyone waiting for Raltok to respond. But instead, he turned away from the blackboard and walked to his desk at the front of the room. He remained silent, his back turned to Sarah. The rest of the students sat in stillness, unsure of how to react. Some whispered under their breath, sharing their shock. "Did she really just do that?" one of them asked, though their words were too low for Sarah to hear. Others stared at the board, as if trying to find a flaw in her work, something that would discredit her achievement. Raltok finally spoke again, his voice lower, more measured than before. "That was unexpected," he said, though there was no warmth in his tone. He wasn't yet willing to admit she had done something remarkable. But that was only one problem. "You have much to prove." Sarah's heart sank a little. She had hoped this moment would be a breakthrough, an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, humans were more capable than the galaxy gave them credit for. But instead, Raltok's challenge felt like it was only just beginning. "Let's see how well you handle the next task," Raltok continued, his eyes narrowing. "I will not be impressed by simple answers." Sarah's mind raced. She could feel the weight of his challenge pressing down on her. He had already made up his mind, she would need to prove herself far more than she had already. This wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was only going to get harder from here. As she returned to her seat, her palms were slick with sweat, and her stomach churned with nerves. The whole class was still watching her, some with skepticism, others with growing intrigue. Sarah could feel their expectations building. They were waiting for her to fail. But she wasn't ready to give up. Sarah took a deep breath and steeled herself. She was here for a reason. Humans might be underestimated across the galaxy, but she wasn't going to let one alien teacher, no matter how powerful, define her worth. As Raltok moved to the next part of the lesson, Sarah's mind began to race again. She would prove them wrong. Not just to Raltok, but to all of them. For the next few minutes, the atmosphere in the classroom shifted. The sense of tension had thickened, like the air just before a storm. Sarah could feel it in her chest, the way the students were no longer simply watching her out of curiosity, but with a keen interest. Every one of them was waiting for her to fail. They had seen it too many times before, a human stepping up, confident at first, only to be broken down by the impossible tasks set by their alien instructors. But Sarah refused to let that happen. She knew that she had done something incredible, even if Raltok wasn't yet willing to admit it. He wasn't going to break her. She had already overcome so much in her life just to get here, and she wasn't about to let some alien teacher crush her spirit. Raltok's gaze turned cold as he grabbed a new slate from his desk, his fingers brushing against the surface as though he were preparing for a final, decisive move. Without turning to the class, he wrote a new problem, far more complicated than the first, on the board. This time, the symbols were layered with strange, intricate patterns that seemed to defy logic. The equations were a mix of alien mathematical principles that Sarah had never encountered. It was a challenge designed for failure. He turned back to face her, his eyes piercing. "This will test your limits. Solve this, and perhaps you will earn my respect," he said, his voice carrying an almost imperceptible edge. Sarah approached the board slowly, her nerves on edge. The symbols looked like nothing she had ever seen before, distant, alien, and daunting. She wasn't sure where to start, and for a fleeting moment, the doubt she had tried so hard to suppress began to creep in. The whispers from the other students grew louder. "She can't solve that. No human could." Sarah clenched her fists at her sides. It was as though Raltok was daring her to fail. But she wasn't about to back down. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to focus, pushing away the noise from the room. She stared at the symbols, feeling the familiar anxiety twist in her gut, but she had to fight it. She couldn't afford to let Raltok win. She reached for the chalk, her hand trembling slightly as she began drawing a framework on the board, creating lines and shapes from the symbols that felt strangely familiar in the back of her mind. There was something about the patterns, something that spoke to her. They were more than just random characters, they were a map. A guide. For the next few minutes, Sarah worked steadily, her mind sharpening as she absorbed each new piece of the puzzle. She didn't know how it was happening, but as she worked, the complexity of the problem started to unravel, bit by bit. The symbols that had seemed alien at first slowly took on a new meaning. The students watched in stunned silence. At first, they had expected Sarah to fail spectacularly, but now, even the most skeptical among them were beginning to doubt their own assumptions. How was she doing this? No human had ever succeeded at solving such advanced problems. Raltok stood at the back of the room, his arms folded. His eyes narrowed as Sarah continued to work. She was solving the problem, but in a way that wasn't textbook by any means. She was thinking in a manner that was completely foreign to the other students and, perhaps, even to him. It was as if Sarah had cracked the code to understanding alien logic by thinking not just outside the box, but outside of the entire framework they had assumed was the only way. Impressive, Raltok finally said, though his voice was laced with a grudging admiration. You have the problem halfway solved. But can you finish it? His challenge wasn't a compliment, it was another test. He needed to see if she could keep up with his expectations. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. The question loomed like a dark cloud in her mind, could she really finish this? Was it possible, or was she about to face her first real failure? But then she remembered something, an old lesson her father used to tell her when she felt unsure of herself: the answer is always inside of you, but you've got to trust yourself to find it. That memory, faint as it was, seemed to light a spark within her. She could do this. She had to. With renewed determination, Sarah pressed her chalk to the board once again, her mind racing as she pushed forward, drawing connections, discovering relationships between the symbols that had once seemed so alien. Her movements were fluid, almost instinctual. She wasn't just solving a math problem, she was dancing with the puzzle, finding its rhythm. The clock on the wall ticked by, but Sarah didn't notice. She was lost in the flow, caught up in the exhilaration of discovery. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. She could feel it, she was so close. A hushed murmur spread through the room as Sarah stepped back and surveyed her work. The problem, once inscrutable and designed for failure, was solved. Not only had she cracked it, but she had done it in a way that was completely unorthodox, a method that would never have occurred to any of the other students. Raltok stood still, his eyes glued to the board. He blinked twice, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The solution was flawless. But Sarah hadn't arrived at it through his expected route. She had used an entirely different approach, one that couldn't be taught in textbooks, one that hadn't been anticipated. There was no denying it anymore. For the first time, Raltok felt a ripple of unease. Perhaps, just perhaps, humans had something they hadn't yet fully understood. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah stood there, breathless, waiting for his verdict. Would he acknowledge her brilliance, or would he dismiss it as a fluke? Raltok's expression remained unreadable, but there was a shift in his posture. He stepped forward, slowly, and then, just when Sarah thought he might speak, he turned toward the class and addressed them in a calm, yet weighty tone. "Observe," he said. "This human has done what no one else could. But you will learn one thing, even in victory, there are lessons to be found." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And for the first time, Sarah felt a small flicker of hope. She had earned his respect, not through conventional methods, but through a quiet, stubborn resolve that even Raltok couldn't ignore. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in her life, Sarah felt that she was no longer a mere human among giants. She was something more. The murmurs from the other students grew louder as Sarah continued to work. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but she refused to look up. The chalk scraped across the board with an almost rhythmic precision, and with each mark, the problem that had seemed impossible just moments ago became more and more solvable. Sarah was no longer just solving an equation, she was unraveling a mystery that stretched far beyond her own understanding. Her hand moved almost automatically, as if guided by something outside of herself. Each symbol on the board clicked into place like the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle falling into position. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt in control. The anxiety that had gnawed at her since the moment she walked into the room began to fade. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but she felt a sense of calm, a quiet confidence that she had never known before. The room fell into a tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Raltok stood motionless at the back of the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His sharp, alien eyes never left Sarah, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. It was almost imperceptible, but Sarah could feel it, a shift from condescension to something else. Something she couldn't quite place. Sarah stepped back from the board and looked over her work. Her chest was tight, and her heart was pounding, but she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The symbols were no longer just abstract markings, they were answers. And the solution was more than just correct, it was elegant. For a moment, she allowed herself to smile. It was a small, tentative smile, one that was more for herself than anyone else. But as her gaze lifted to the class, she froze. The students, who had been watching her in silence, were now looking at her with wide eyes. The skepticism that had once been etched on their faces had been replaced by something new, something like awe. But it wasn't the students who made Sarah's heart skip a beat. It was Raltok. The teacher's usually implacable expression had softened, just barely. There was no smugness in his gaze, no hint of the superiority that had been so evident when he first called her to the board. Instead, there was something almost human. Something that resembled respect. For the first time since she had entered the academy, Sarah could see that Raltok had been taken aback. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. This was it. The moment that could define everything. If she had solved the problem, truly solved it, she would have proven herself. Not just to Raltok, but to all of them. The other students, the ones who had so easily written her off as insignificant, would have to admit that they had been wrong. But Raltok's next words made Sarah's blood run cold. "Very well," he said, his voice heavy with something she couldn't quite decipher. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze never leaving her work. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just stood there, scrutinizing the symbols on the board. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for him to pass judgment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned his gaze back to Sarah. "You have solved it," he said, his tone unexpectedly neutral. "But there is something wrong with your approach." Sarah's stomach dropped. What did he mean? The solution was correct, wasn't it? She had checked it, double-checked it. Her hands shook slightly, but she refused to back down. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady, though her insides were churning. "The solution is correct. The pattern holds. Every symbol aligns." Raltok's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was something almost cold in his gaze. "You have solved the problem, yes," he said, his voice a little slower, each word deliberate. "But you did not solve it the way it was intended to be solved. Your method, while effective, is unorthodox. You did not follow the conventional steps. You did not think like the others." Sarah blinked, trying to process what he was saying. I didn't follow the conventional steps because they didn't make sense. They didn't fit the problem. I had to trust my instincts." "You trust instincts," Raltok said, his voice low, almost contemplative. "You do not think like us, Sarah. You think like a human. You did not apply the rules of the galaxy, you applied your own. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Raltok wasn't just commenting on her method, he was making a statement about the very nature of human intelligence. He wasn't saying that her approach had been wrong. He was saying that it had been different. And that difference was something neither he nor any of the other students had been prepared for. The room had gone silent again, the students watching with rapt attention. They had seen the way Sarah had solved the problem, and now they were seeing how Raltok, the greatest teacher in the academy, was reacting. His disbelief was evident. He didn't know how to process what he had just witnessed. Sarah's heart pounded as she took in his words. She felt a surge of pride not just for solving the problem, but for doing it in a way that no one had expected. For thinking differently. For embracing the very thing that made humans unique, their ability to think outside the confines of rigid rules and predefined patterns. "You've solved the problem, Sarah," Raltok repeated, almost as if he were still trying to convince himself. "But in doing so, you've proven something more, the value of thinking beyond the limits of our understanding." Sarah looked at him, her expression steady. "Maybe that's the answer you've been missing," she said quietly. "Sometimes, the solution isn't in the rules. It's in what's outside them." For the first time, Raltok was silent, and Sarah could see that something inside him had shifted. The classroom felt different now, quieter, as if they were all waiting for him to process what had just happened. And for the first time, Sarah felt the flicker of something she hadn't expected, a sense of belonging. Maybe, just maybe, humans had something to offer that no one had anticipated. Something that could change the galaxy forever. The weight of Raltok's words hung in the air like an invisible cloud, suffocating all other sounds in the room. Sarah stood frozen, trying to process the implications of what he had just said. She had expected praise, or at least acknowledgement for solving the problem. But what he had given her instead felt more like a judgment, and worse, one she wasn't entirely sure how to challenge. "You think like a human," Raltok repeated, his tone measured but sharp. "A creature of chaos. You trust emotions, impulses, not logic. You see patterns that others miss, but you don't follow the strict rules of mathematics, of precision. You are unpredictable." There it was. The heart of the challenge. Raltok wasn't just criticizing her method. He was pointing out the very thing that made her human, her ability to think differently. To feel. To trust in something beyond pure logic. And in the alien world that Raltok inhabited, that was a weakness. Something that couldn't be quantified, controlled, or predicted. Sarah's mind raced. She had spent so much of her life fighting to prove herself, fighting to show the world that she belonged here, that she could thrive in this strange new environment. And now, Raltok was telling her that the very thing that made her human was the very thing that might stop her from succeeding. The class had gone completely still. The students, once whispering in awe, were now watching her with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. They had expected her to fail, expected her to be an easy target. But now, she had done something they couldn't ignore. They didn't understand it. They couldn't replicate it. But it had worked. Raltok's eyes flickered to the other students, his gaze hardening. "I will not let this pass without further challenge. You may have solved the problem, Sarah, but you have done so at the expense of logic. Your next task will prove whether you can truly think like us." Sarah's heart sank. Another test? After everything she had just done, she wasn't sure how much more she could handle. She glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of a few students who now seemed more unsure than ever. Their initial smugness had faded, replaced by something closer to doubt. Could humans really be this unpredictable? Before she could respond, Raltok turned his back on her and returned to his desk, typing something into his datapad. The rest of the students were still whispering, though now their murmurs were less judgmental and more speculative. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, but she tried not to let it affect her. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about proving something to herself. She took a deep breath, pushing down the rising anxiety. Her thoughts were swirling, but one thing was clear: she wasn't about to let Raltok's challenge break her. She had to face this head-on. There was no turning back now. Very well, Raltok's voice sliced through the silence again. Your next task is to solve this. He presented another set of symbols, more complex than the last, if that was even possible. This time, there were layers within layers, impossible geometries that seemed to have no clear solution. Sarah didn't flinch. She had been here before. When she first arrived on this alien world, she had felt like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. But now? Now she knew better. She didn't need to conform to their standards of logic. She didn't need to think like Raltok. She just needed to think like herself. Her fingers brushed the chalk as she stepped forward to the board. She felt the weight of the room on her shoulders, but also a growing sense of purpose. The solution would come. It always did. If she could tap into her own way of thinking, her own intuition, she could solve this, just like she had solved the last. As she began to write, a strange calm settled over her. She wasn't going to rush this. She wasn't going to let Raltok push her into making a mistake. She knew the pattern would reveal itself, just like it had before. And this time, she would do it her way, her human way. Minutes passed as Sarah worked, her mind racing through the symbols, finding hidden connections in the chaos. There were moments where she felt she was losing the thread, but she pushed through, trusting her instincts. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place, like a mosaic taking shape. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the way Raltok or his students would solve the problem. But it made sense to her. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the other students watching her again, their gazes sharp and focused. They were no longer mocking her, they were waiting. Waiting for her to finish. Waiting for her to prove that she could do it again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah stepped back from the board. Her chalk trembled slightly in her hand, but the solution was there. It wasn't neat, and it wasn't linear, but it was a solution. And it was hers. She turned to face Raltok. I'm done, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. The room fell into a heavy silence. Raltok walked toward the board, his steps measured and slow. He stared at the symbols for what felt like an eternity. Sarah held her breath, waiting for his judgment. He seemed to scrutinize every detail, every line, as if searching for a flaw. And then, to her shock, he turned back to her, his expression unreadable. You did it again, he said, his voice low, almost grudging. Your approach is unorthodox, but it works. In your own way, you have solved the problem. Sarah felt a sense of relief flood through her, but it wasn't just relief. It was vindication. She had done it. She had proven something, not just to Raltok, but to herself. Raltok paused for a moment, studying her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Perhaps, he began slowly, there is more to human intelligence than I gave credit for. The room was silent, the students exchanging glances, unsure of what to make of Raltok's words. Perhaps, Raltok repeated, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful, you are more than just a chaotic species after all. For the first time since she entered this classroom, Sarah smiled. She had done it. Not just for Raltok, but for herself. And that, she realized, was the true victory. Sarah stood frozen, her chalk hovering just above the board, as the room fell into an almost oppressive silence. The weight of every student's gaze felt like a tangible pressure, but she didn't flinch. Not this time. She had faced enough in her life to know that she couldn't let the fear of failure hold her back, not now, not when she was so close. Her mind was clear, the symbols on the board beginning to look less like indecipherable alien writing and more like a puzzle with edges that were finally starting to align. But even as she completed the final stroke, her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't help but wonder, would Raltok accept this solution? Would the other students see it the way she did? Or was she walking into a trap, once again on the verge of failure? Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped away from the board, turning her gaze toward Raltok. His face remained an unreadable mask, but his eyes flickered toward the symbols, scanning them with a critical, almost calculating look. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was as though the entire room was holding its breath. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the lights overhead. Even the other students seemed to be waiting, their eyes darting back and forth between Sarah and Raltok, unsure of what was about to happen. Then, finally, Raltok spoke. "Well," he said, his voice cool but with a hint of something, impressed? Sarah couldn't be sure. "You have done it again, human. You have solved it." A wave of relief washed over her. She had done it. Against all odds, she had completed the task. But she wasn't celebrating just yet. She could see it in Raltok's eyes, there was something else coming. She had earned his acknowledgement, but she had also just proven a point. This wasn't just about solving puzzles or equations. It was about something deeper. Something that even Raltok couldn't ignore. "You have proven your intellect," Raltok continued, his voice no longer laced with the usual condescension. Instead, there was something more measured, respect, perhaps. "But I have to wonder, do you even understand why your approach is so difficult for us to accept?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. "I solved the problem, didn't I?" Raltok's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, they were no longer the cold, alien eyes of a superior being. There was something human in them. A flicker of something Sarah couldn't quite name. "You solved it," he agreed, "but in a way that violates everything we have been taught. You did not follow logic. You did not adhere to the precision and structure that we value. You relied on something we do not understand, emotion, intuition, impulse." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "You mean, my human way of thinking?" Raltok gave a slight nod, though it was not quite approval. More of an acknowledgement. "Yes. Your human way of thinking. It is chaotic, unpredictable, but it is also brilliant. I cannot deny that. But it is also what separates you from us." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room felt like it was holding its breath again. Raltok, who had once seen humans as little more than flawed creatures, was now confronting something he hadn't accounted for. Something that made him question everything he knew about intelligence, logic, and even his own species. "You've given me a puzzle," he said softly, almost to himself. "One I don't know how to solve." Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" He turned to face her fully, his expression thoughtful. You think differently. We have always believed that intelligence is about structure, about following patterns, about fitting into the framework of the universe. But you," he paused. "You've shown me that intelligence isn't always about fitting in. Sometimes, it's about breaking the rules. About seeing things from angles we cannot even imagine." It was a moment of clarity for both of them. For Sarah, it was the first time she truly realized what she had done. She hadn't just solved the problem. She had shifted the very foundation of what Raltok, and by extension, the rest of the galaxy, had believed about intelligence. Her human way of thinking, her ability to trust in her instincts, her emotions, was something they could not predict, something they could not replicate. And that, Sarah realized, was her true strength. The other students were quiet now. They were no longer whispering among themselves. They were watching Sarah, not with disdain, but with something else. Curiosity. Respect. They were starting to understand. "Perhaps," Raltok continued, his voice thoughtful, there is something more to human intelligence than we have been taught. Perhaps we have been too focused on the wrong things. Sarah felt her heart swell with a mixture of triumph and something deeper. She had done it. Not just for herself, but for all of humanity. She had shown them that humans didn't need to conform to alien standards of intelligence. They could think in their own way, see things in their own light, and still come out on top. And yet, as Sarah stood there, looking at Raltok, she knew the journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning. She had earned his respect, but there was so much more to prove. For herself. For humanity. And for the future of their place in the galaxy. Before she could respond, Raltok spoke again, this time with a hint of something new, something like admiration. Perhaps it is time for us to consider that we do not know everything. Perhaps we have more to learn from you than we thought. The room was silent for a moment, but then one by one, the students began to nod. They, too, had seen it now. The truth in Sarah's approach. Something that couldn't be ignored. Sarah looked around the room, feeling the weight of it all sink in. For the first time since she had arrived in this alien world, she felt like she truly belonged. And for the first time, she realized that being human, being herself, was enough. She was ready for whatever came next. The weight of Raltok's words settled on Sarah like a soft blanket, wrapping around her in ways she hadn't expected. The teacher, once so certain of his superiority, now seemed uncertain, even vulnerable. It was a vulnerability that transcended species. It was the kind of moment that could only come from truly understanding another being. And for the first time, Sarah felt like she wasn't the outsider, the misfit. She felt like she belonged. But as the class sat in silence, Sarah knew there was still much more to this moment than what had been said. Raltok had acknowledged her, yes, but there was more at stake than just solving puzzles or winning one battle. She had just proven something far deeper than intellect. She had shown them the value of human resilience. Raltok's eyes softened as he looked around the room, meeting the gazes of his students. His voice broke the silence once more, this time slower, measured. Perhaps we were wrong about you, human, he said, turning to face Sarah with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. You are not merely a creature of chaos. There is an elegance in your unpredictability, a strength in your instinctual approach. The class was still, their eyes wide with surprise. For the first time, they weren't looking at Sarah with pity or disdain. They were seeing her not just as a student in their class, but as a force to be reckoned with. And though Raltok was still the instructor, for the first time, he wasn't speaking from a place of authority. He was speaking from a place of reflection, of learning. Sarah felt a surge of something deep inside her. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was something quieter, more profound. She had come to this alien world, doubted and underestimated at every turn, and she had fought to prove herself worthy of being here. But now, she understood. The test had never been about solving equations or demonstrating superiority. The test had been about finding the strength within herself to stand up and show them all that human intelligence wasn't something to be dismissed, it was something to be revered. I think you have all underestimated the value of humanity, Sarah said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything she had learned. We're not perfect. We make mistakes. We're unpredictable. But that's what makes us capable of greatness. We don't always follow the rules because sometimes the rules don't fit. We think beyond what's written, beyond what's been proven. And sometimes, that's exactly what the universe needs. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was a strange quiet, a shared understanding that spread through the room like a ripple in water. Raltok didn't speak for a while. He simply regarded her, his alien eyes intense, as though seeing her for the first time, not as a student, not as a human, but as someone who had shown him a new way of thinking. A new way of seeing.